I'm Larry Fedoruk, and this is I Was 8, my weekly podcast. Stories about growing up in a small town on the great Canadian prairie. By the way, on next week's episode, both agony and ecstasy. But this week, mostly horror. Well, I was probably more frightened than you'll be. Let's move on with Season 2 of I Was 8.
Chapter 3, Birds.
I have a fear of birds. I wouldn't call it a debilitating fear, but in the neighborhood. Nor would I call it a phobia, which is an irrational fear, because I, on the other hand, respect any bird's ability to swoop down in an instant, pull a vital vein from my neck, and wing away quickly to use the vein in building its nest while I lay twitching and bleeding out on the sidewalk in front of my house. I think that's reasonable. I've been told that my fear of birds may have started before I was 8, and when I was just a toddler being babysat on my grandparents' farm. My grandmother baked bread. In a wood-burning stone oven, by the way, an oven handmade by my grandfather. And as soon as the bread sufficiently cooled, little Larry got a fresh, doughy, warm slice, complete with a giant thick smear of Grandma's homemade strawberry jam. Let's pause for a moment. What kind of world am I describing where this actually happened? Oh yeah, it did. It was Eden. Cool late summer morning, Larry with a big slice of freshly baked bread with jam, the whole thing about the size of my head. What could go wrong? Well, I guess every Eden has its serpent, the Satan looking to cause trouble. In my case, Satan was the farm chickens. They had the run of the yard, and they believed that Larry plus bread plus jam equaled feeding time for them. And they didn't wait for me to throw crumbs their way. Oh no, they came right up to me and began pecking the bread right out of my hand. Small side note, an average chicken can be up to 2 feet tall. Average toddler, about 3 feet tall. These monsters came up to my chest. Imagine a giant bird with crazy eyes, a ginormous pointy knife beak, beginning to pull the food right out of your hand. There's only one plan of action. Drop the bread and run. Fight or flight? Flight. Flight now boarding. Leaving immediately. Grandma, the chickens attacked me. From that day on, warm bread and jam would be enjoyed inside Grandma's cottage, the hook in the eye of the screen door. Suck it, chickens. You're getting nothing. Take my bread and jam. I'll get you one day. Famously in our family, when I was allowed crayons and drew pictures of chickens, the drawings were nothing more than a large beak with eyes and legs. Look, Mom, I drew a chicken. My mom saved all the drawings in case she ever had to show them to a psychologist one day. I got over my fear of chickens, mostly. Oh, but I didn't forget about the promise of revenge. Revenge, much like chicken, is a dish that can be served cold. I've eaten as many as I could over the years, maybe about 1,000, not including wings, plus well over 5,000 chicken eggs in the course of a lifetime. That doesn't include quiche. Sometimes right after eggs, toasted bread and jam to complete the circle. All I'm saying, chickens, how could you take my food and not think there wouldn't be retribution? I've exacted my vengeance. If I was Rambo, my former commanding officer would be Colonel Sanders. Well, let's not dwell on it. It's revenge, and it's ongoing. Though my fear of birds may be rooted in, let's just call them the chicken incidents, I don't think it's the defining moment. I think that came later. Later, when I was 8. By the time I was 8, I understood the difference between chickens and most other birds. Chickens couldn't fly. Oh, sure, once in a while they freak out, they flap their wings and run, maybe get a foot of air for a few seconds, but that's not really flying. I'll cite the great bird scientist and researcher Alfred Hitchcock, whose Birds documentary, starring Tippi Hedren, illustrated that point so well. It's the ability to fly that makes the difference. It gives them the advantage. Once they amass and decide to attack, it's over. Still think it's just a phobia? Of course, Superman can fly, but he doesn't have a beak. Plus, Superman is good. Birds are evil. So what is the defining moment of my fear of birds? Well, I'll tell the story, but as soon as I start, I guarantee you'll get way ahead of me. There's no way around that. Feel free to mentally skip ahead, but here goes. I've mentioned in other stories that we lived in a small town and both my parents worked. After school, I was on my own for a couple of hours. Now, all of us kids enjoyed meandering after school, taking our sweet-ass time to get home. But I could always devote extra time to meandering, because no one was really expecting me. Meander, stop and look at a fence post for like 15 minutes, meander some more. Oh, look, a truck is driving by. I better stop and watch that for a while. And then some more meandering and still make it home in time for the Flintstones. The walk from our school to our house was maybe 5 minutes. Now that's 5 minutes as an adult at a healthy pace, but as an 8-year-old, shorter legs, smaller steps, meandering, some days could take up to an hour. The route was also quite simple. From school, 1 block, turn right, 3 short blocks, you're home. This was rarely the route taken, the meandering. As a kid, you cut through people's yards, down a back lane, through another yard. That type of trespassing, perfectly acceptable. Most people didn't mind a kid taking a shortcut through their yard, as long as he didn't step in the garden or wreck anything. If you got bored with plain meandering, you could always try kicking something down the street. Now, one might picture an idyllic small town where in the old days, kids walked around kicking tin cans down a dirt road. I always wonder where that came from, because when I was a kid, there weren't a lot of tin cans around. Beverages came in bottles. And yeah, we had canned goods, but us kids didn't end up with those cans that often. However, the idea of kicking something down the road, well, that was fun. A real skill, a talent. We would exchange stories. I found this pebble on the schoolyard and I kicked it all the way home without losing it. Oh yeah? Well, I did that, and then at home I took the pebble up to my room and next morning kicked it all the way back to the schoolyard again. Did not, did too, did not, did too, infinity. My idiot friend Philip told me a story about his cousin who went to high school in the city, last summer kicked a tennis ball across all of Saskatchewan, and this year was going to try and kick one across all of Canada. Well, who couldn't? A tennis ball, when you kick it, it goes really far. Try doing that with a rock. There were unwritten rules to this. If you kicked your stone or whatever into the ditch or a puddle, out of play, game over. And you couldn't just kick something a few inches at a time. That was nudging, not fair. You had to give it a real kick. And as soon as you started kicking something, you had to establish a finish line, like the crack in the sidewalk in front of your house. And you couldn't declare a win until you kicked your object over that line. You could stop halfway, pick up the stone, and resume the kicking game the next day at the same spot. But that was only in extreme cases, like sudden bad weather, or your parents were yelling at you to get home. I'm sure there were other rules, but those were the basics that I remember. Which brings us to a winter Wednesday after school, not cold enough for a kid to have to cut short his meandering. As a matter of fact, that day, I decided to add some lollygagging. I loved lollygagging. My mom hated it. She was always like, "Stop your lollygagging." But to me, Nothing like a good lollygag. I found it very relaxing. So I'm lollygagging at the front of the Warwick's driveway across from school. I was about to cut through their yard when I see this chunk of ice. I give it a big boot up the driveway and it slides like 10 feet, didn't even chip. Well, let's see how far we can kick this baby, maybe all the way home. Next kick would be tough because the driveway narrowed as it passed their house and then slight dogleg right toward the garage. I lined it up, big kick, massive shot, still on the fairway. Next, a short strategic kick required to get it onto the path by the shed, heading for the back lane. Good. Next shot, going for the back lane. It flew so far, I lost sight of it. I ran quickly and found it almost in the ditch, almost game over, out of play. But I think technically, if I got a ruling, I was still in the game. It was resting on the edge of a piece of snow. This would require a football place kicker technique, which I executed flawlessly. The ice went airborne and almost made it all the way to the street. Kicking it down the street was a breeze. There were ruts in the snow and ice on the road from the cars. It was like this thing was a luge whipping down the chute. In front of my house, kicking it out of the rut would require some finesse, but I managed a pretty good chip shot. Although a little too close to the Caragana hedge. The only way to kick it out and into my yard for the victory was to use my left foot. I was right-footed, but I was so close I couldn't give up now. I made a few practice kicks, just in the air, and approached my chunk of ice. 1 step, 2 step, left foot kick. The ice hit our walkway, again without chipping, and slid right up to the step at the door. The perfect shot. Victory! Victory, victory is our cry. V-I-C, no, V-I-T, no, V-I-C, V-I-C, V-I-C-T-E-R-Y-O-R-Y. Well, no, never mind. Victory. If my friends could see me now. Wait till they hear about this at school tomorrow. I walked up to the piece of ice and really stared at it for the first time. It was such a great piece of ice. Maybe I could take it in the house. Dad would let me keep it in the freezer for a few days until I had time to play another kicking game. I picked it up and stared some more. I noted that this hard piece of ice was kind of shaped like a bird. I noticed things like that even when I was 8. I thought, not only is the ice shaped like a bird, but right where the bird's eye would be is a perfectly round piece of dirt or stone or something. Looks just like a bird's eye. Wow. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 Mississippi, 4 kid screaming. You got there before me, didn't you? That's right. It was a bird. A frozen bird. I had kicked a dead frozen bird all the way home. I screamed and threw the ice into a snowbank. I ran into the house, locking the door behind me for some reason. To think how close I came to having that thing in my freezer. Eek! That was it. With the chickens, that Birds documentary with Tippi Hedren, and now the fact that all birds knew I had disrespected their dead, my fear of birds was solidified, so to speak. 8-year-old logic, grounded in the chicken history, told me fear all birds. It's me against them. Now, of course, grown-up logic says that's ridiculous. But in the deep psyche, the 8-year-old wins this one. I had nightmares all week. On Saturday, I took out our big snow shovel and dug all through the yard until I found that chunk of ice. I put it on the shovel, piled it up with snow, and then I carried the shovel to the edge of town and halfway across a farmer's field before dumping it behind some bushes. In that memory, I always wonder who saw me. I can just hear the neighbors. Oh, look, some kid is walking down the street into the field with a big snow shovel. Is it the fedora kid? Yeah. Well, last week, I saw him kicking something down the street, and after each kick, he jumped up and down, waved his arms, and cheered. Huh. All right. Each subsequent year gets a little better, but I've never really conquered my fear of birds. Each bird I see seems to have that dead, cold eye staring at me as if to say, "I know what you did." I tolerate birds at best. I'll cross the street to avoid a pigeon. I will not go to the park and feed the ducks. Each spring, the sight of the first robin gives me a mild anxiety attack. And yet, I have feather pillows on my bed. Each night I doze off, worrying that in the middle of the night, the feathers will reassemble themselves into a chicken and attack me. I sleep with one eye open.
I Was 8 is a weekly series written, produced, and voiced by Larry Fedoruk. A new episode every Thursday. Share your stories with Larry, or if you like, share Larry's stories with a friend. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Larry Fedoruk, that's Fedoruk, can be reached at larryfedoruk37@gmail.com.